so decolonization and future studies. And in this section, I just want to talk about what decolonization means in the case of future studies and how it's been discussed in the literature. So there's, I would say, two primary ways that decolonization was discussed, and these aren't mutually exclusive, and there's commonalities between both of them. And one is decolonization in a metaphorical sense, and this is how Jim Dator talks about it in his article, Decolonizing the Future. I paraphrase some of his quotation here, but he wrote that the colonizers of the future are the bad guys who irresponsibly wield incredible long-range power, such as building contractors, housing developers, freeway builders, defense manufacturers, etc., even like teachers, parents, who make decisions that effectively shapes the future and limits options and alternatives for others. So some things to note here is that the future isn't a neutral thing. There's already colonizing in the metaphorical sense, limitations imposed on us by the powerful, the rich, the influential, who are able to colonize their preferred future, or just a vision of the future on the rest of us. And against these colonizing limitations, it was Jim Dator's opinion that we could use future studies as a tool to decolonize the future by creating alternative visions of the future. And there's this second, I would say, approach or maybe trend. And this is decolonization in a more historically specific sense, as a way to find alternatives to the West. And this is sort of embodied by Nandy and Ziad and Sardar. I have their photos there. And basically, Nandy thought that authentic alternatives to the West can be difficult to find because of the psychological impacts on the non-West. I just want to note that Nandy was also a clinical psychologist in addition to a lot of the other sort of hats that he wears. So like Dator, Nandy sees future studies as a way to overcome these impasses and create alternatives to non-West, for non-West futures. Because even when we want to think or go beyond the West becomes, because of the influence of Western knowledge systems, it remains the point of identification. So our concepts, the language we used, all of this has been colonized the West in this sort of perspective. So what ends up happening is that Sardar wrote this, but to be anti-West is equivalent to be pro-West. But again, like in Dator's example, finding alternatives becomes a recurring theme. But of course, like decolonization is like a very, very large topic, and it's not the way that decolonization is discussed in future studies is not the only way that decolonization operates as a concept. So for example, in Tuck and Yang's paper, decolonization is not a metaphor. They write that decolonization should be about restoring indigenous land and life. So they take a very, very historically specific definition to what decolonization should be. So calls for decolonizing schools, methods, like student thinking, knowledge systems. All of these, for them, turns decolonization into a metaphor. So I just talk about this briefly here because I want to share like maybe a counter perspective to Dator and Nandy and Sardar. But moving on, what kind of future studies is necessary for alternatives? So as I stated again, both in Jim Dator and for Nandy and Sardar, finding alternatives is of key importance. And of course, this is an established pursuit in the history of future studies with organizations like the Institute of Alternative Futures and the World Future Studies Federation. But what kind of future studies is best for generating alternatives? So there are a couple of characteristics that I found through reading the literature. One is that it's a future studies that's non-disciplinary because our disciplines end up disciplining us. I can't remember who said it, but like I found it a very good and succinct quote. And this type of non-disciplinary characteristics helps us to generate imaginative, experimental, creative thinking. And secondly, it's future studies that opens up non-Western futures using the categories and concepts of the non-West, and not just by using established Western knowledge structures. And thirdly, it's future studies that avoids institutionalization and insularity. Sardar wrote about this in his famous article on decolonizing future studies. And he wrote something like, if there is an institutionalization of future studies based on the Western world, then it'll mean the end of it'll mean that future studies will be the means for colonizing the non-Western future itself. And like, while I present Tuck and Yang's definition of decolonization as sort of like a counter perspective, these finding alternatives can also intersect with projects to restore land and life in their definition.